Hello everybody and welcome back to Whittle Reads. Today I just want to do a bit of a wrap up and just talk about some of my recent reads. I'm not going to be doing it month to month currently, that's the plan at the moment, but I won't talk about that now. I'll talk about a bit more about that at the end of the video, but I just want to jump straight into books. So, let's start off here. So, Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin. I read this is my first read of June, and it was incredible. I'm not going to talk too much about this book because I have a full video up talking about what I loved about it. It is hard sci-fi. If you do know you love sci-fi, this is definitely a book for you. But if you don't know if you love sci-fi but want to try like the classic hard sci-fi, this is probably the place to start because it really doesn't alienate the reader. It talks about some incredible elements, especially if you love discussions on things like gender, and if you want something with really unique developments of foreign cultures, this is a really great book to go for. Completely recommend it. I loved it. It was so good that I had to pull out the sticky tabs, which is something I never ever do. But I might have to do more because I don't want to miss incredible things like the things that are in this book. So yes, loved it. Completely recommend. First book of June. Done. My second book of June was Normal People by Sally Rooney, which is a book a bit out of my comfort zone. It's something I wouldn't normally go for and only did because of the overwhelming recommendation from V. So glad I read it. This is up there for, at the end of the year, I'll probably do a 2020 wrap up. This is going to be there. I can tell you that now. It surprised me in so many ways and appealed to me in ways I didn't think it would. I normally read books about worlds and greater things and fantastical elements. So a book which is literally just about two people, there really isn't even much of a plot, but just the descriptions and the things she says. Like, this isn't just a book about people and things that happen to them. This is an analysis of the people. It's not talking about people. It's talking about what makes us people. I don't want to go into this too much because this is a book I read with V. V read it a few months before me, but we've both read it and both have a lot to say. And I want to do a video of us talking about the books we've both read and have discussions about them. And that's where I really want to say what I have to say about this book. But until then, read it. Just read it. I would be what I assumed would be so far away from the target audience of this book, and I still adored it. So there's really no one I can think to not recommend this to. If I had to give a brief synopsis, this book is about two people, Marianne and Connell, who both grew up in Ireland, and it's how their roles in high school very much changed and their real growth from high school into university and the interactions they have with each other, and it explores some really interesting aspects of teenage culture, but also just peer pressures and popularity and things like that without it's I wouldn't call it a coming of age. There's not real any moral or underlying thread to this book. It's just brutally honest, and there are some things it talks about where it's like before it talked about it, I didn't even realize there was still taboo around some of those things. It's just so blatantly just tells you things with so much honesty and so little shame and guilt that it's refreshing to read. But again, I'm getting into way too much into this book. I want to save all that for my conversation with V, which will be up here eventually. That's probably the next video we're going to film. Love it, read it, get it. Amazing. The next book I read, which I believe is actually my 1st of July, was Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This was actually a bit of a return to form for me. I have stayed away from thriller and horror since I was like 15, 16. I recently read another Stephen King, but it was Firestarter, which isn't the most scary. So this was really my return. I didn't even plan on getting this book at first. V saw how cheap the hardcover was for both this and Serpent and Dove. Haven't read that one yet. And wanted to get it because the book looked incredible, and she'd also heard amazing things about it and knew Leigh Bardugo from her earlier YA works. I'd never heard of her. Again, you're going to find a common thread through this entire channel is I've been living under a rock. I can try to use the excuse that I grew up overseas and haven't been in like the Western world for the past more than a decade, but that excuse is probably not even close to the reason why. But yes, Ninth House, it's dark magic. It paints magic as this dark, scary thing, like everything else in the world, used by the elite. Specifically, this book takes place in Yale, and how the different Yale societies use magic, very dark magic, often involving organs and you know, doing bad things to good people, or very ethically iffy things, basically to maintain their own wealth. And so it is such a depressing way of viewing magic, but such an accurate one, where you do feel if magic did exist in this world, like everything else, it would be hoarded to the wealthy people who could use it for their own gain. But it never gets too political. It never gets into that too much, but it does just talk a little bit about class issues at elite universities, but also has a brilliant system of magic. It isn't horror scary. There are some definite thriller elements. If you don't like reading about gore or graphic things, stay away from this book. It definitely comes with some form of a content warning, but it never came close to giving me nightmares. And even though I've read a lot of horror, I definitely get spooked easily. This book never quite spooked me, but it always had me on edge. It's definitely that crawl down your spine that thriller often gives. Brilliant debut. I want more, and I would love for her to go deeper into the magical systems in this universe, because ultimately this book, I'd say, is mostly about the character and the plot. And whilst there's an incredible world around that, me being a fantasy sci-fi person, I just want to see more of that, and that will happen in the next books in this series. So I'm sticking around. I can't wait for the next one. Again, recommend it. Read it. So the next book I'm going to talk about, I don't actually have with me, which is really unfortunate, but I'll if I know what I'm doing, I should have digitally put it in somewhere. I don't actually have it right now because it was so incredible. There's already a list of people I want to lend it to, and it's currently with my sister. So Vows for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. It's again in the same sci-fi masterworks edition that my Left Hand of Darkness is in, but it really couldn't be further on the opposite end of sci-fi to Left Hand of Darkness, where the Left Hand of Darkness I can easily recommend to someone who loves sci-fi. Flowers for Algernon is one of those books that I can recommend to anyone. It's the same way that normal people, even though I didn't feel the target audience, I still loved it. I feel like anyone could love Flowers for Algernon, because the sci-fi elements are honestly so light that they're almost barely there. It really isn't about like the science of it. The basic synopsis is there is a person who has a mental disability. They have an extremely low IQ, and they are given an operation which begins to boost their IQ, and it just follows them through this enlightenment and realizing how the people he thought were on his side weren't. And it's a beautiful book, and I want to give as few spoilers as possible. I'm going to do a teensy-wincy spoiler, so skip like 30 seconds ahead if you don't want to see this. Basically, he's given this surgery. After this mouse, Algernon is given the surgery. And he watches as Algernon gets extremely intelligent, but then something starts to go a bit wrong. And he starts to wonder about whether he is after the same fate. And so he uses his newfound intelligence to really try to understand what his future holds. And it is... Okay. Spoilers are gone. You can feel free to come back. This book made me cry. Sci-fi books never make me cry. And I'd have to say... But I feel like this couldn't make me cry if it wasn't a sci-fi. Just the little speculative element of it, which does make it a sci-fi book, is what makes it so heartbreaking and tragic. And it's a story you couldn't see in any other genre, which is why I love sci-fi. And it makes some really good points about the humanity of people with mental disabilities. And there is a massive element of him being furious with the researchers who gave him his intelligence, because they feel like they made him a person. They created him. And he's always insisting that, no, I was a human before. I was already a human, and you have now changed me into this new human, but I was always a person, so how dare you say you created me? Which is such an incredibly profound thing to say, and especially someone who's trying to go into the field of psychology, it's an important thing to read. I feel everyone who wants to study psychology or practice psychology needs to read and understand this book, and psychiatry as well. It is just a profound look about how people work, how people think, and how we should not classify people with disabilities as non-human. Which sounds like it is obvious, but it's the same way that the statement, you shouldn't be racist, is an obvious statement, but there are all of these little elements in our society that are ableist, that are racist, which we do have to deconstruct. And this book points out a few that I hadn't noticed. Incredible book. Cannot recommend it more. It is important. It is heartbreaking. It is beautiful. Read Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. Wherever you can. Next, I have another book that I want to save the majority of the discussion for my talk with V, but this book, Such a Fun Age by Kiley Reid. Again, another book I never would have read, and I have mixed feelings about it, to be honest. The elements of race in this book are incredible, especially because they talk about niche issues. This isn't much of a spoiler. The very first chapter, the whole issue, the whole event that this book is centered around is this African-American woman is the babysitter for this quite affluent white family in Philadelphia, I believe it is. And there's an emergency one night, and they need the babysitter to come out and take their child just for a few minutes. It's late at night. The babysitter was at a party, and she completely told the parents this, so she's done everything right by the parents and by the child she's taking care of. So she shows up in party dress, and then takes this little girl just to a local, just like the grocery store, just to keep her away, because apparently the police are going to be coming to that house, and they just don't want the kid to see that. Obviously, the parents are doing the right thing, the babysitter's doing the right thing. The babysitter's there with the child, they're having a great time at the grocery store, and a security guard comes up after an older white woman reported them, but even then, not overtly, just said she was concerned. And basically this woman is then starting to be accused of kidnapping this child. So she ends up calling the father of the child, who comes in and clears it all up. But he's furious, and she's furious, and it is very clear that this would not have happened to a non-black babysitter. And so there's that racial element right at the beginning, and the rest of the book all orbits around that, but not in the way you'd expect. It just introduces some of the themes to this book, and the race themes in this book are incredible, and by far my favorite part of this book, and the reason I kept reading. That's because Kiley Reid does an incredible thing in this book, in that she paints it with very subtle but very real racism, and it shows there's no one in this book, even the woman who reported the babysitter to the cop, isn't overtly racist. She was just concerned, and whilst that is probably the most obvious racist act, and the way the security guard act, of the entire book, and even then, it isn't overt. It's never given a name. It is just this subtle event that pisses everyone off, and it's clearly wrong, but it is far more subtle than a lot of the elements of racism that people would normally use as examples. And throughout the book, it talks about how she dates a white guy who fetishizes black people, potentially. And so there are subtle issues like that. Fetishizing of black people, and the person who, her employer, the mother of the child she babysits, starts trying to help her in a way that doesn't include her in the story. So ultimately she's using her for her own gains as well. And so it just talks about how everybody really uses this girl for their own means because of her race, and do not respect her personhood as much as they potentially would a white person. But again, it's so hard in this book to point to one specific act and say that this is an obvious act of racism, whilst still that's what the entire book is about, and the crafting on that is incredible, and I will never have anything but complete respect for the author. The element I didn't like is basically the backbone of what this book is built on. If you took out all the race elements, which you shouldn't, that's what this book's about, but if you did separate that out, what this book is a babysitter who has a boyfriend and her dealings with her employer. And I would never, ever, ever read a book about a babysitter and her dating life or things like that. Those are just the elements in books that just don't interest me. And so if it didn't have those race elements and those really interesting discussions, like, I feel like this is a really clever layering of those elements over what is a very standard, quite often explored structure of a book aimed at younger women generally, which is just not for me. It's just not aimed at me. And it's not meant to be aimed at me. It's not my criticism of the quality of the book in general. Just that is the kind of story I would never read. And so whilst I think this is the best example, and the example that's always going to appeal to me of that kind of genre, of that kind of story, it's still not my kind of story. So if you would read a book about people, about a person's relationship to their boyfriend or their job as a babysitter, if that is the kind of story that would generally appeal to you, this is an incredible example of that. if that sounds like something you would never read, there's still going to be something in this you can find useful. I am very glad I read this book. I really did enjoy reading this book, even if what the plot, if the most generic bare bone structure of the plot isn't something I would usually enjoy, and I'd say kept me from enjoying it as much as I would like to have of. It's still a great book, and I'm still very glad I've read it. And I have a lot more to discuss with V about this book. But yeah, Such a Fun Age by Kiley Reid. If you think potentially there's the smallest chance that you could enjoy this book, pick it up. You're gonna love it. Honestly, I'm still glad I read it. I think everybody should read it, even if it's not my specific cup of tea. The next book I have here is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. This book came about, and it says in the foreword by Stephen King, which is a brilliant foreword, which I didn't read until the end of the book, because often, especially because this is like a centenary edition, so often these are the kind of books that everyone assumes you've already read the book and you're just buying this edition. I've never read Lord of the Flies before, so I just skipped the introduction and went straight into it. But this is the one part I can say, which is definitely not a spoiler. Lord of the Flies arose from William Golding's conversation with his wife of saying he just wished someone wrote a book about how kids really are. This book is really a play on a style of book that was really prominent in I'd say the World War II up until like the 50s era in Britain, which are all these books about British children getting stranded on some foreign island where they, get sticks together and build a boat or a submarine and go do these wondrous things and convert the natives to Christianity like good British boys. And ultimately, because they're so hardy, because they're British and they're proud of being British, that they just act perfectly and get themselves and save themselves and just build a perfect empire, just like all us good colonialists do. And this book just tears that apart. But again, it's not intending to show why they're ridiculous. It's just saying what would really happen in that scenario. It really just explores what real British children would do if they were stranded. And I'm not going to go more into that. It's a very well-known book, but I knew very little about it going into it, which is, again, one of the reasons I loved it so much. But I think William Golding completely nailed it. This is what children would do. And it really brought back memories of childhood, of just how cruel children can be at times, and how egotistical they are, which is just because of their age. It's not because, children are bad people. They're just young and ignorant and have not grown into themselves yet. But really seeing what happens if you leave them to their own devices is really interesting, and I feel like can be applied to us as adults, because I feel like a lot of these elements, they never really go away. We just get better at hiding them as we get older. And so, again, such a classic. It's stupid for me to recommend what is already such a widely renowned book. But yeah, if you're looking for my opinion on it, yeah, read it. Go ahead. Oh, I feel like such an idiot recommending such an incredible book that is already so famous, but whatever. I normally do try to plan my reading so that one book flows into the other, where either they're quite different, so it's a nice change, or maybe if there's an element I want to explore, I set up a few books in a row of quite similar things that just means I can really get into this issue I've been wanting to read about for a while. I made a bit of a boo-boo here, which isn't necessarily on purpose. V and I have been going through and reading all the original Harry Potter series, and this started way back at the beginning of the year, and we're trying to read one a month, though this month we have been very slow getting started in Order of the Phoenix, and have just gotten a bit stuck in the mud with them. But the one that we read last month was Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. The reason I bring up all of that about crafting which books to go through is because I just read Lord of the Flies, which is all about how kids would really act in these extreme situations, and then this is a book about how these young kids act extraordinarily in these really dire situations. And the one thing I kept on thinking was, oh, this isn't how the kids would act at all. No, they'd probably just freak out and run away, or they'd just die. I didn't realize how much, as a kid, you love your heroes being other kids who do the things you're too scared to do. But after reading Lord of the Flies, my suspension of disbelief was just completely shot down, and it took me a long while to get back into this book. But trying to ignore all those elements, just talking about the book itself, from what we've been reading through, I love Prisoner of Azkaban reading it, and again, it's my favorite of the movies, but this book, the first half of it felt so stilted and boring, and because I knew where it was going to end up, like the final scene of this book is very intense, and it read so much still like a children's book at the beginning. Whilst I remembered reading this for the first time as a kid as being like the real transition to adult Harry Potter books. You know, not adult, but, you know, older teenager, or the more adult ones compared to Philosopher's Stone. But the first half was a kid's book, and I found it really hard to get through, and I was so bored, to be honest. But then the second half picks up, and it just takes this twist and turn into darkness in a way that really does save it. So as a kid reading this book, I could understand how incredible it is. And again, I have to, like, I'm not a YA reader or a middle grade reader, so reading this book, I'm so not used to, like, trying to put myself in the head of a younger reader reading this book, even though I read this book as a younger reader. So it is like, it's not written for me. Again, it was never aimed at me, but I did, by the end of it, come out really enjoying it. The first scene of the book is the real reintroduction of Voldemort, and it was just so cheesy, and I was filled with so little terror for the main villain of this book. But by the end, it had ramped up a little bit. So I'm interested to see where the series goes, but I obviously know where the series goes, but I'm interested to see where, you know, my assessment of Voldemort as the literature character rather than the film character will be interesting. But again, I'm not in any urgent rush to dive in. So this is actually the last book I finished last month, and so I'm now up to my current read, which I did start last month. Halfway through, I got through, you know, from Ninth House to Harry Potter. I read 4 books in around like 17, 18 days. I was really blazing there, and so I thought, time to really punch in on one of the bigger books I've been avoiding, to try to carry that momentum through. And that is when I started Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong. Again, if you are somebody who speaks any of the languages of these authors and notices my pronunciation being terrible, please do correct me. I want to try to pronounce things as well as I can, and so I'll give it my best shot, but I'm probably going to mess it up. But moving on to the book itself, I feel like I can talk about this book because even though I am not finished it, I am 250 pages in, so I am around a book into this book, and am absolutely loving it. I never realized how funny this book was meant to be, you know, because Don Quixote has always talked about this real classic, this real highbrow literature, and I never realized how funny this book is and how lovable it is, and whilst there's still so much for me to read, it has none of the dryness I expected, and potentially that is due to the incredible translation by Edith Grossman. This is the translation I would recommend for sure, and whilst I haven't read any others, I did my research before getting this one and reading this one, and this seems to be the consensus of the best translation to read. The footnotes in this book are incredible, and they give you all the context so that all of the jokes hit home exactly where they're meant to, and she really does maintain, she doesn't anglicize it, or anglicize it, she makes it's still such a Spanish book. And all of those elements, I feel, as a white non-Spanish person, so what is my opinion really? I feel like I'm actually learning a lot about Spain and Spanish culture, especially in this kind of time period, which was 1605, so things may have changed since then, but I'm loving reading it, and it really is probably my first foray into translated works. However, before I end this video, I'm going to briefly touch on the books I want to get to next month, and they go into that a bit more. Completely recommend Don Quixote if you're afraid of classics but do want to read a classic. I can't think of anywhere better, to be honest. It does not use ye olde English. It uses very modern English, but maintains that sense of it being spoken by people quite a long time ago, whilst being completely and utterly understandable. I was so put off when I started reading Dickens, and whilst I'm trying to jump back into it because I feel like I need to read Dickens, it honestly wasn't the most enjoyable experience. I'm loving reading this, and even though it's a 900-page book, and this is like, I'm aiming to get this done in the next few weeks. I don't know if I will, but I'm happy to take my time. I really am, and it's one of the reasons I wanted to do a video in this style rather than a June wrap-up and a July wrap-up or what have you. Just doing a general big wrap-up, it means I don't feel rushed, because if I had to do a wrap-up video at the end of this month, I feel I'd have to speed through this book. I really don't want to. I want to spend my time, take my time, reading through this absolutely wonderful book, which I am loving. And I feel like I can only do that if I don't feel the impending embarrassment of a wrap-up video where I say, haven't finished anything, or I finished one book, which isn't a video at all. So I'm happy to make these videos not as frequent, covering a bit longer a time period, so that when I do get to a massive book, or a book which I just want to take my time with, I don't have to sacrifice my enjoyment. Because ultimately, I'm reading because I love reading. And I do love reading. And I love reading this. So, Don Quixote. Completely recommend. Go for it. Well, that is really the end of... That's where I'm at with reading. So that's the last few months. I have not read a book that has put a foot wrong. I'd recommend all of these books. I love them all. If you want any more of my thoughts, or especially for the books like Normal People, Such a Fun Age, that I'm going to be talking with more with V, please write something in the comments. That would be excellent. The only one thing I just wanted to quickly wrap up with, because again, they're not quite big enough books for me to give their own video, but my August TBR would be to finish Don Quixote, which is going to be enough of a goal in itself. What really I'm going to get to next is, first of all, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. This is one of my first... I bought this in the first load of Black Lives Matter books, and I'm very interested to read it. I grew up in a very international place, but even now with this movement, I am seeing more and more how racism was still prevalent in a place where I thought I was exempt. I don't want to go too personal, I don't even openly release my name here, but I grew up in the Middle East, in a very multicultural place, but went to a British school, and seeing how still elements of racism infiltrate even somewhere so far away, so far afield, that isn't even classified as the Western world, just really made me realize even more how deep-seated this issue is. Even though I've been aware of it almost my entire life, it still hasn't escaped me, or I still haven't escaped it. It is still so prevalent, and something I feel I need to educate myself on, and I educate myself through books, and so I'm going to read as much as I can. This is the first of those, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. I'll read it and I'll get back to you. And the next book is another recommendation from V. So far she's batting 1,000 with all of her recommendations. This is Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. And V gives it a bit of an introduction into... we did a little video on books we've recommended each other. And this was on that, so she does a great summation of it, and I haven't read it, so I can't really say. All I know is time travel, so it really is already hitting all of the bases for me, and I can't wait to get into this. But yeah, so these are my upcoming books. When I'll get to them, nobody knows, because I have to get through this first. Just for reference, this is what 250 pages looks like, so... I'm nowhere close. I've just hit a quarter of the way through, and that's taken me a while. So, might be a while before you see another wrap-up video, but there's plenty more coming. We've already got 2 recorded videos of V and I talking about books. One of them which will be uploaded Monday, if the current plan goes ahead. You might have actually already seen this. This might actually already be uploaded. If that's the case, click it here. I don't know if this is where I'll be able to fit the link, but if I can, that's good. I'm still learning how to do the whole video editing thing, but I'm going to give it a go. Expect videos once a week, potentially a bit more often, but I don't want to get ahead of myself and force a schedule I can't keep up with. So 1 video a week on Monday is the bare minimum, and if I can throw in a few extras, I'll give that a go. Thank you so much for watching my recent reads, my bit of a wrap-up. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope there was something in there you liked, and I recommend all of those books. And I think it was a diverse enough range that everybody should be able to find something in there that they would like. Everything I've mentioned today will be down in the description below, so you don't have to try to pan through and find the book recommendations. And apart from that, please like, comment, subscribe, comment with recommendations for tags or books to read or discussions you want V and I to have. Absolutely anything, and I'd love to hear, or just corrections of my terrible pronunciation of people's names. Absolutely anything. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.